Good afternoon. We're back with another episode of the LOTR LCG progression series. And today is a card review of the Treachery of Rhudaur. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Yeah, maybe not. Treachery of Rhudaur. Anyway, let's take a look at the cards. So far, this cycle, this is the 4th adventure pack, and I've only seen one playable card for solo play. Playable meaning really good. There's plenty of fun cards, but I would rank this as the weakest of the cycles so far in terms of solo cards. But I'm hoping that will change. So let's take a look. The hero for this adventure pack is Galdore. He's a lore hero, 10 cost, 2/2/2/4 health. So stats aren't good. Draw 3 additional cards at the beginning of the resource phase. At the end of the round, discard all cards in your hand. That's very interesting. So that completely changes the way you play the game and design your deck if you're going to run an Galdore. You'd want to be able to, generally speaking, play the cards that you draw in the same turn that you draw them, or else you would just lose them. Interesting. Well, his stats aren't good. You're playing him for the ability, so we'll start there. Is the ability good? Well, you have to design a deck around it. You can't just throw him in a deck and expect it to perform well, because typically you design a deck and mulligan a hand, intending to be looking for a hand that will allow you to get off to a good start in the first 2 or 3 turns. You want cards that will allow you to overcome the challenges of the early game. And often in a quest that means clearing a active location that starts in staging, or is the active location quickly because it has some detrimental effect. Sometimes that's overcoming a big enemy that starts in staging. Sometimes it's overcoming 2 enemies if it's a tough quest. Sometimes it's just getting set up early, which is not so much a problem in terms of mulliganing and your starting hand. So I'm going over this because I see a problem with this champion in solo play in a number of quests, which is typically when you're going to try to overcome the challenge of the early game in solo, the challenge doesn't scale up that much. So in multiplayer games, the early game challenges of quests is often less than in solo play, which makes the early game in solo play much more important, which I've said repeatedly in my card reviews. And this hero has a weakness early game, which is you're only going to be mulliganing for 3 cards essentially, instead of 6. So I'll explain a little further. So I'm going to explain my thinking about Galdore using the program that I use for games. Okay, so when we're evaluating a starting hand, normally, we look at all 6 cards and we think about a couple of things. Number 1, think about turn 1. If I keep this hand, what am I going to play on turn 1? Because often against a quest it's really, really bad to not be able to play anything on turn 1 that's helpful. And sometimes you just lose, depending on the deck or the encounter deck, if you can't play, for example, a blocker for a big enemy or additional willpower to help you overcome whatever's in the staging area to start the game and make progress. You could just get willpower or location locked right away. So anyway, it's very important to have a turn 1 play. Now, with Galdore, that's not going to change. You're still looking for a turn 1 play. However, there's also a secondary concern when you mulligan, which is how does this hand curve out? And what I mean by how does this hand curve out is how does it play on turn 2 and 3. Ideally, you want plays for all of those turns in your opening hand, because then you don't have to rely on draws. So turn 1 is good, turn 1, 2, and 3 is better, and ideally what you're looking for with some consistency in your opening hand. With Aristor, you can't do that. You can only look at turn 1 because all of the other cards in your opening hand are going to go away at the end of the round. So that is the weakness of this card in the early game. Now, to compensate you get an additional 3 cards during the resource phase. So instead of 7, I start with 1, 2, 3. So that's a lot of options for turn 1. You probably get to use all your resources every turn to start the game that you do that. But does that compensate you for not knowing what plays are going to be available to you in turn 2 and 3, and therefore not being able to mulligan your hand to set up the early game well? That's a big question. I don't know the answer. It would require playtesting, but it's a big question and a big change in the way that we'll play the game when Aristor is a hero. So at the least, I consider this hero very interesting. Very interesting as a support utility hero. His stats are nothing to speak of, but they're not terrible. I don't think it's an issue that you can't play the ally. I'll be very interested to see some deck lists with this. I'll be very interested to try to make one myself. I don't know that he specifically allows you to overcome any particular challenge. It's going to be huge variance because of the inability to plan for future turns. Like almost always when I have a hand, I have an idea about what I want to do this turn, and I have an idea about what I want to do for the next turn. Until you get to the mid to late game and you've played everything useful from your hand and all you're left with duplicates, in which case this card is extremely good. So I guess that's his ideal usage scenario, right? In a normal quest that lasts for a little bit, you run out of plays essentially in the mid to late game. You'll never really run into that problem with Aristor, and so that's where he's going to shine. So my thinking about this card is that it's a little bit weaker in the early game because of the inability to plan for turns 2 and 3 with any degree of accuracy when you're mulliganing. That makes him a little bit weaker in the early game and a little bit stronger in the late game when you would normally run out of plays. Potentially very strong in the late game. Now, unfortunately, in solo play, usually a little bit weaker in the early game is bad. How weak he's going to be in the early game is going to vary wildly. You could draw exactly what you need for turn 2 or 3 and be just fine. You could draw garbage for turn 2 or 3 that you normally would have mulliganed. But on average, I expect him to be a little weaker in the early game and better in the late game. And is that playable in solo play? I'm interested to try him and find out. I don't think it's a slam dunk yes. I don't think it's a slam dunk no. I'm uncertain about this hero. Needs to be play tested. But I like that he exists because he's interesting. Very interesting card. Just taking a quick glance at the decks other players have come up with, there are some interesting ones. So, I do like this card. I like this card. And I would be strongly tempted to get this adventure pack just for this card. Now, I don't think it's just a straight up powerful card, in that it's not like a Glorfindel who fits in nearly every deck under the sun, or an Elrond who's going to be featured in like a deck that can potentially defeat every quest, including the Nightmare ones. So I wouldn't rank him as tier 1, but I do think he's very strong, very interesting, and well worth a look. Let's move on to the other cards, and hope to come back to Aristor in future videos, perhaps playing him, perhaps even for this quest, the Treachery of Rhudaur. Reinforcements, 3 cost. You must use resources from 3 different heroes' pools to pay for this card. Action, the players as a group can put up to 2 allies into play from their hands. Each of these allies may enter play under any player's control. At the end of the phase, return each of those allies that are still in play to their owner's hands. Well, if it had just stopped at playing the allies, I think it'd be good, albeit hard to set up because it's basically a monosphere card for solo play. But considering they return to your hand at the end of the phase, this is not a good card, I don't think. You only get 2 allies for 3 resources? So I guess you'd have to play at least 2 2-cost allies, and that would only save you 1. A 2 and a 3-cost ally would save you 2. So that's at a minimum what you would need to do, but honestly, for a one-time use, you probably need to play like a 4 and a 5 or something like that to make this good. That's not going to be very often. This is not a good card. It's a very niche card in that the situation that you need to set up to make it good is difficult to do and is therefore not going to happen very often. Send for Aid. 1 cost, needs 6 progress, limit 1 per deck. When this stage is defeated, each player may search the top 10 cards of his deck for an ally and put it in play under his control. Pretty strong effect. High cost to play in that you have to spend a turn on it. But I see the same issue with this side quest that I see with all side quests. They don't scale up or down based on the number of players in the game. So I'll explain. In solo play, you have to make 6 progress on this, and then you get 1 ally. In multiplayer, you get 4 allies in a 4-player game. But you still only need to make 6 progress. It would make more sense to me if it said like the progress needed that you need to make is like X, where X equals 2 per player or something like that. I would like that design better for this side quest and for side quests in general. As it is, I think the cost is too high in solo. I really like this effect. It's probably the strongest of the side quests. The other one that's really strong is the draw 1 card from your deck. But the caveat of needing to spend 1 turn on it is a high price to pay. Now, this isn't going to be that good for players who are playing a lot of low-cost allies. But for like an Elrond Villia deck or something with a lot of high-cost allies, this could be very strong. But even that being considered, I don't think this is that good in solo because you have to spend a turn on it and you only get 1 ally. In multiplayer, spending 1 turn on it for 4 allies, now we're talking. But I'm kind of meh on it in solo. I see side quests in solo decks a lot, so I know not every player agrees with me, but so far I just have not seen one that I really thought was worth spending a turn to complete. Elvin Spear. 0 cost, attached to a Noldor or Sylvan hero restricted. Discard a card from your hand to give attached hero +1 attack until the end of the phase. Limit 3 times per phase. Interesting. So another card that gives you a use for duplicate cards. Would that be good with Aristor? I suppose if you drew cards that weren't useful. But you'd have to discard practically your whole hand to use it. So not really, I don't think. So it does nothing unless you need it to, but what if you don't have cards that you like to discard? I mean, a lot of games you'll have, I would guess over the course of the game, 4, maybe 5 cards that aren't useful if it's a long game, and your deck has a lot of duplicate cards. You end up with 4 or so by the end of the game that you don't want, so you'd only be able to get 4 attack out of this and not attack every turn, really. I don't think this is good. I think that's too high a cost to pay every turn. Though potentially +3 attack could really make a difference. But it's like almost a one-time use thing. Unless you've really got strong card draw. But, I mean, 0 cost is good, but I don't really think this is good. I don't see myself playing it. Horn's Cry. 2 cost. All enemies get -1 attack until the end of the phase. choose a player. Each enemy engaged with that Valor Action. Choose a player. Each enemy engaged with that player gets -3 attack until the end of the phase. Well, that could be really good, the Valor Action. Now, is the regular action good? -1 attack. So if you had one enemy engaged with you, I don't think it's that good. If you had 2 enemies engaged with you, it really depends. It really depends. I don't think it's going to be good every time you have 2 enemies engaged with you. It may be redundant sometimes because a lot of the time when an encounter deck has multiple enemies, they're all like lower attack value enemies, and so the one attack might go on an enemy where you didn't really need the help. Now, the Valor Action is really good. So basically with the regular action, you're just kind of treading water with it until you get to 40 threat. Like, you might use it if you really needed it, but generally you'd hang on to it until you got to 40 threat and then use it. That makes it a late game card. As far as late game cards go, it's pretty strong. But it is a late game card and not an early game card. But one that I will keep in mind for specific challenges, because this could be... Sometimes quests are designed to put out like 2 or 3 enemies at once in the last phase. Wastes of Rhudaur comes to mind, where you have to flip to Nightfall. You put the pack leader in staging, you flip the Nightfall, revealing a card which could generate potentially 1 or even 2 more enemies if it surges. And then if you're playing a multiplayer game, you could have to add 1 more after that. So if you were eliminating the attacking ability of 2 or 3 enemies at once in the late game, that could be very strong, even game saving. So I like it for that. I don't think the regular action is that good though. And a strong late game card has to be really strong before we use it in solo play if it's weak early, because dead cards early are bad since solo's weak early, but the fact that this is so strong late game makes this worth a look. Galadrim Weaver, 1 cost, 1001, cannot attack or defend. It's Sylvan. After Galadrim Weaver enters play, shuffle the top card of your discard pile into your deck. Well, I don't think that's that useful. Yeah, it's very high variance. Odds are you won't even see that card again, but I guess if you're playing this, it's going to be in a Sylvan deck, probably for the early game willpower. And for that reason alone, it's fine for questing. But I don't think I would use it unless you're struggling for early game willpower. Like if you're running Celeborn and then, I don't know, 1 or 2 other heroes that are kind of weak on questing, then you might run this card. But if you're running 2 strong questing heroes, I don't think you really need it, and I probably wouldn't run it. Silver Harp, 2 cost attached to a spirit hero restricted. After a card is discarded from your hand, exhaust Silver Harp to return that card to your hand. Okay, so my feeling about this card is that it is one piece of a puzzle, and we're not seeing the whole puzzle yet. It clearly has no effect unless you're playing another card that discards a card from your hand, right? So it has to be a puzzle piece. And it's probably going to be a useful card in some combo decks. Well, like Rhudaur, at the end of the round, discard all cards in your hand. You could return one of them. That alone is useful, I think. Now, is it worth 2 cost and a card to do that? I think you need a specific combo that you're looking for. I don't think you just stick it in an Rhudaur deck, generally. Maybe you would, though. It's really hard to say. Very interesting card, potentially useful card. I certainly don't think there's no situation in which I'd play this, and could potentially be an important part of a combo deck. Galdore of the Havens, 4 cost, 2/2/1. Not good stats for his cost. After 1 or more cards are discarded from your hand, draw 1 card. Limit once per round. So we're starting to get a picture of what combos might be available. They are building this up. The developers of the game are building this up into a synergy, discarding cards and then bringing them back, or probably eventually playing them from discard pile. And so this will be one to keep an eye on. There will almost certainly be some decent combos around discarding cards, playing them from discard, or bringing them back to hand, as there are with Sylvans, putting them out on the table and then bringing them back to hand. I think this is a new thing that they're building up, and I'm very interested and looking forward to it. And cards like Silverharp and Galdore could potentially be very important to combos in the future, in addition to Aristor. The door is closed. Response after an encounter card is revealed from the encounter deck, cancel its effects and discard it if there's a card with the same title in the victory display. Wow, is that specific? My gosh, so it's meant to combo with that. It's only an encounter card. So if you have discarded, if you've stuck an enemy or a location in your victory display with one of those cards from the previous adventure packs, and then you happen to find its brother in the encounter deck, you can use this to discard it. That's very high variance. It's very good when it happens. It's just not going to happen very often. Most of the time this is going to sit in your hand. Do you run 3 of them in your deck? Then have 3 of them sitting in your hand if you draw them all, or 2 of them? I like the idea, but I think you need more ways to add cards to the victory display before this is good. Right now it's cool when it works, but it's not going to work very often. If it does, you're ecstatic, but it's not going to work very often. Probably a fun card. I think that whole idea of putting cards in the victory display to buff Raw Seal or playing the doors closed is probably a fun deck right now. Maybe it gets strong later, but right now it seems like a fun deck, but not more. Elf Friend. 1 cost attached to a character. Attached character gains the Galdore and Sylvan traits. Interesting. That could be good for... Yeah, so let's see. You could play Light of Valinor on that character, right? Not have to exhaust a quest. There's a number of different cards you could do this with, though I'm not certain why you would specifically need a character to gain Galdore or Sylvan. Why not just play a Galdore or Sylvan hero and save yourself the card slot, because there are some really good ones. But there might be situations where this card actually makes sense. It's possible. It's an interesting combo card. Overall, this adventure pack is very interesting. I like it a lot. Compared to the previous 3, this is definitely the best one of the cycle. Definitely. The best one of the cycle, and I hesitate to say with certainty that I recommend that players buy this, but I will say if you do buy this, it's going to make for some interesting deck building, and I'm looking forward to playing some of the cards myself. And there's cards here that are hard to evaluate without playing them. But I like the idea of some of them, and I think building a deck around them, like Aristor in particular, could be very good. Elf Friend has possibilities. Galdore and Silverharp have possibilities for combos. It's very interesting cards. I'm happy with this adventure pack. So, thanks for watching.